Plato wrote that love is the pursuit of the whole, but he also wrote that it's a serious mental disease. Both are very true in my experience. My name's Tricia Sulpizio. I'm your host for another episode of Tea and Bedtime Stories, a podcast for anyone who appreciates a good book. In this episode, we will continue A Farewell to Arms, a novel by Ernest Hemingway published in 1929. Last time we read Chapter 3 in Book 1, and we will continue with Chapter 4. When the chapter concludes, I will again follow up with quick facts and my impressions. So now, we'll start Book 1, Chapter 4. The battery in the garden woke me up in the morning, and I saw the sun coming through the window and got out of bed. I went to the window and looked out. The gravel paths were moist, and the grass was wet with dew. The battery fired twice, and the air came each time like a blow, and shook the window and made the front of my pajamas flap. I could not see the guns, but they were evidently firing directly over us. It was a nuisance to have them there, but it was a comfort that they were no bigger. As I looked out at the garden, I heard a motor truck starting on the road. I dressed, went downstairs, had some coffee in the kitchen, and went out to the garage. 10 cars were lined up side by side under the long shed. They were top-heavy, blunt-nosed ambulances, painted gray and built like moving vans. The mechanics were working, one out in the yard. 3 others were up in the mountains at dressing stations. "Do they ever shell that battery?" I asked one of the mechanics. "No, Signor Tenente. It is protected by the little hill. How's everything?" "Not so bad. The machine is no good, but the others march." He stopped working and smiled. "Were you on permission?" "Yes." He wiped his hand on his jumper and grinned. "You have a good time?" The others all grinned too. "Fine," I said. "What's the matter with this machine?" "It's no good. One thing after another." "What's the matter now?" "New rings." I left them working, the car looking disgraced and empty with the machine open and parts spread on a workbench, and I went in under the shed and looked at each of the cars. They were moderately clean, a few freshly washed, and others dusty. I looked at the tires carefully, looking for cuts or stone bruises. Everything seemed in good condition. It evidently made no difference whether I was there to look after things or not. I had imagined that the condition of the cars, whether or not things were obtainable, the smooth functioning of the business of removing wounded and sick from the dressing stations, hauling them back from the mountains to the clearing station, and then distributing them to the hospitals named on their papers, depended to a considerable extent on myself. Evidently, it did not matter whether I was there or not. "Has there been any trouble getting parts?" I asked the sergeant mechanic. "No, Signor Tenente." "Where's Gasoline Park now?" "At the same place." "Good," I said, and went back to the house and drank another bowl of coffee at the mess table. The coffee was a pale gray and sweet with condensed milk. Outside the window, it was a lovely spring morning. There was that beginning of a feeling of dryness in the nose that meant that the day would be hot later on. The day I visited the post in the mountains and was back in town late in the afternoon. The whole thing seemed to run better while I was away. The offensive was going to start again, I heard. The division for which we worked were were to attack at a place up the river, and the major told me that I would see about the post for during the attack. The attack would cross the river and up the narrow gorge and spread up the hillside. The post for the cars would have to be as near to the river as they could get and keep covered. They would, of course, be selected by the infantry, but we were supposed to work it out. It was one of those things that gave you a false feeling of soldiering. I was very dusty and dirty and went up to my room to wash. Rinaldi was sitting on the bed with a copy of Hugo's English Grammar. He was dressed, wore his black boots, and his hair shone. "Splendid," he said when he saw me. "You will come with me to see Miss Barkley." "No." "Yes, you will please come and make a good impression on her." "All right, wait till I get cleaned up. Wash up and come as you are." I washed, brushed my hair, and we started. "Wait a minute," Rinaldi said. "Perhaps we should have a drink." He opened his trunk and took out a bottle. "Not strega," I said. "No, grappa." "All right." He poured 2 glasses and we touched them, first fingers extended. The grappa was very strong. "Another?" "All right," I said. We drank the second grappa. Rinaldi put away the bottle and we went down the stairs. It was hot walking through the town, but the sun was starting to go down and it was very pleasant. The British hospital was a big villa built by Germans before the war. Miss Barkley was in the garden. Another nurse was with her. We saw their white uniforms through the trees and walked toward them. Rinaldi saluted. I saluted too, but more moderately. "How do you do?" Miss Barkley said. "You're not an Italian, are you?" "Oh, no." Rinaldi was talking with the other nurse. They were laughing. What an odd thing to be in the Italian army. It's not really the army. It's only the ambulance. It's very odd, though. Why did you do it? "I don't know," I said. "There isn't always an explanation for everything." "Oh, isn't there?" I was brought up to think there was. Well, that's awfully nice. "Do we have to go on and talk this way?" "No," I said. "That's a relief, isn't it?" "What is the stick?" I asked. Miss Barkley was quite tall. She wore what seemed to me to be a nurse's uniform, was blonde, and had a tawny skin and gray eyes. I thought she was very beautiful. She was carrying a thin rattan stick, like a toy riding crop, bound in leather. "Oh, it belonged to a boy who was killed last year." "Oh, I'm awfully sorry." "He was a very nice boy. He was going to marry me, and he was killed in the Somme." "Oh, it was a ghastly show. Were you there?" "No. I've heard about it," she said. "There's not really any war of that sort down here. They sent me the little stick. His mother sent it to me. They returned it with his things." "Had you been engaged long?" 8 years. We grew up together." "And why didn't you marry?" "I don't know," she said. "I was a fool not to. I could have given him that anyway. But I thought it would be bad for him." "I see. Have you ever loved anyone?" "No," I said. We sat down on a bench and I looked at her. "You have beautiful hair," I said. "Do you like it?" "Very much. I was going to cut it all off when he died." "No." "I wanted to do something for him. You see, I didn't care about the other thing. And he could have had it all. He could have had anything he wanted if I had known. I would have married him or anything. I know all about it now. But then he wanted to go to war and I didn't know." I didn't say anything. I didn't know about anything then. I thought it would be worse for him. I thought perhaps he couldn't stand it. And then, of course, he was killed, and that was the end of it. "I don't know." "Oh, yes," she said, "that's the end of it." We looked at Rinaldi talking to the other nurse. "What was her name?" "Ferguson, Helen Ferguson. Your friend is a doctor, isn't he?" "Yes, he's very good." "Oh, that's splendid. You rarely find anyone any good this close to the front. This is close to the front, isn't it? Quite. It's a silly front, she said, but it's very beautiful. Are they going to have an offense? Yes. Then we'll have to work. There's no work now. Have you done nursing long? Since the end of 15. I started when he did. I remember having a silly idea he might come to the hospital where I was, with a saber cut, I suppose, and a bandage around his head, or a shot through the shoulder, something picturesque. This is the picturesque front, I said. Yes, she said, people can't realize what France is like. If they did, it couldn't all go on. He didn't have a saber cut. They blew him all to bits. I didn't say anything. Do you suppose it will all go on? No. What's to stop it? It will crack somewhere. We'll crack. We'll crack in France. They can't go on doing things like the Somme and not crack. They won't crack here, I said. You think not? No. They did very well last summer. They may crack, she said. Anybody may crack. The Germans, too. No, she said, I think not. We went over towards Rinaldi and Miss Ferguson. You love Italy? Rinaldi asked Miss Ferguson in English. Quite well. No, understand, Rinaldi shook his head. Bastante bene, I translated. He shook his head. Oh, that is not good. You love England? Not too well. I'm Scottish, you see. Rinaldi looked at me blankly. She's Scottish, so she loves Scotland better than England, I said in Italian. But Scotland is England. I translated this for Miss Ferguson. Pas encore, said Miss Ferguson. Not really? Never. We do not like the English. Not like the English? Not like Miss Barclay? Oh, that's different. She's partly Scottish, too. You mustn't take everything so literally. After a while, we said goodnight and left. Walking home, Rinaldi said, Miss Barclay prefers you to me. That is very clear. But the little Scottish one is very nice. Very, I said. I had not noticed her. You like her? No, said Rinaldi. Okay, that concludes chapter 4 of book 1. So a few quick facts. A battery, when he starts off the chapter, he talks about a battery. It's just a large group of different types of big guns and a lot of troops that coordinate their attack formation so that they can all go off in the same direction or wherever they're going, firing the guns all at the same time. And it's a whole thing. But I think you kind of got that from the context. And he called him Signor Tenente because of his rank of lieutenant. Ernest enlisted in the Italian Red Cross. Well, he volunteered stateside, but he was volunteering for the Italian Red Cross, who happened to be recruiting in the United States for volunteers. And somehow he got enlisted in the Italian army, and they made him a second lieutenant, which is pretty advantageous because without a college degree, he would more than likely have just been enlisted in the U.S. Army. And so I think he kind of lucked out. Maybe that was why he did it. I don't know. But the Red Cross does a lot of really interesting work. They usually handle prisoner swaps. They don't only just do medical stations and try to help that way, but they also help to try to clean up relations after wars end, which I find kind of fascinating. Okay, grappa, when he was talking about grappa, it's an Italian brandy. It's a digestive just like strega is, but it's made from this yucky sentiments that are left over when you're making wine. And somehow they distill that and make a brandy out of it. Sounds gross to me. the Somme, when she talks about the Battle of the Somme, it was fought between July and November of 1916, and it's still to this day the bloodiest battle in British history. In that 4-month span or whatever, 5 month, there were 1 million soldiers wounded on both sides of that battle. It was so stupid. I'll leave the link in the description to a video where the Wikipedia page that talks about the Battle of the Somme, and you can actually watch the entire thing. And well, it's a documentary put out by the British government, and they show the before logistics of it. They show the during, and it's all propaganda, and it's a silent film, so it's a little boring, but you see them out there with their horse and buggies lining up. It's crazy. They were not prepared for machine warfare. And anyway, watch it. It's fascinating. And when they were talking about the difference between English and Scottish, there have been long-standing animosities between those two peoples, but they all fought on the side of the Allies. And in fact, Scottish volunteers made up a large percentage of the British Army, up to 15%. And so my impressions of the chapter, I was correct in suspecting that his lifestyle was a bit futile. I could see hints of that, even though it wasn't in the text. And so he's kind of leaning into that, explaining in detail in this chapter exactly how useless he is in his current position, which I used to be a co-owner of a collision repair shop, and wasn't a mechanic shop, but I can tell you, yeah, someone in his position, the supervisors don't do a lot. They kind of mostly stand around and watch other people work, so that makes sense. That tracks. But yeah, his life seems pretty meaningless at this point. And the whole summer camp thing, that's probably what it feels like for him. Even though obviously there's guns going off and it's dangerous, but he still kind of describes it like for him, it's just adult summer camp. So, I don't know. The contrast between where they are and the Battle of Somme is really stark. I think it's another one of those point-counterpoint things that he is famous for in his writing. But that so much had changed between when the Battle of Somme had been fought in 1916 to 1918. Like, the war effort was in hyperspeed, and so they went from horse and buggies to now cars, trucks, planes, machine guns, large-scale artillery, and a much more coordinated effort. So I'm certain that the people, right, there were submarines, all that new technology was more than anyone who was probably in the war conflict could wrap their mind around, right? These were isolated peoples. They weren't reading the paper every morning with breakfast. And so they didn't know what was going on. Like, the soldiers that described first time they saw tanks, because the military never told them what was happening, that they were building these things. They just unleashed them, like a dozen of them in that first conflict. And even the soldiers on the Allied side were like, what on earth is that? And it scared the Germans so much, seeing these big giant metal machine things coming at them, that they ran until they figured out, oh, they're all stuck in ditches and they're not doing much. And then they ran back and tried to, blow them up and stuff. But it was a little dystopian, I guess you could say, for them. And I'm sure for the people in the war, they didn't know what all was happening. And in Italy, especially, because it was far behind what, like, France England and the United States were doing, and Germany as well, what they were all doing in terms of their scientific advancements. And they were quite a bit behind the times. So I think that's why she's describing it that way as well in their conversations. Anyway, I also found it interesting how easy it was for them to classify the different women that they meet in terms of their sexual availability, right? How Rinaldi knew he was going to marry this woman without knowing anything about her. I find that fascinating. It was obviously a high context culture, meaning everything means something, right? Currently we're in a low context culture. So people, even though you heard them say this one thing in particular in a specific way, they still try to deny that they said it. And in high context cultures, that everything means something, every gesture, every, eye movement, and people pick up on that and they read those signals. So they were probably much more in tune to nonverbal signals, I imagine, at this time in American history or even Italian history. And so just the fact that she was talking to him or making eye contact with him, she's obviously very comfortable talking about herself and very personal details about her life. That probably gave his roommate Rinaldi the impression that she was flirting with him, as weird as that sounds to us today, because she's just talking about her life in a matter-of-fact way. But to them, they probably saw that as deeply intimate. And because she's classified in the category of women that are the types that you marry, every interaction to them probably it's a part of the courtship ritual that leads to marriage. Fascinating. Okay. Even though it's not based on anything real, right? It's all limerence. It's all imagination. It's all in your head. For them, it probably feels very real. And especially being in wartime, right? It's trivial conversations, but they're talking about serious things. Anyway, I just think it's fascinating. And if we look for signs like they do, when you're in a highly romanticized mindset and you convince yourself that they're there, it's in a weird way like a self-inflicted delusion. And you could say that it's like the pursuit of the whole leaves us with a mental disease of sorts, like Plato was describing. I don't know, I find it all fascinating. Anyway, that concludes my commentary on chapter 4. In the next episode, I'll be reading Book 1, Chapter 5 of A Farewell to Arms. Please join me again for more tea and bedtime stories. I thank you and look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks for listening.